Okay, so looking at our first line of defense, so basically first line of defense, I think it should be used kind of colloquially. According to the study design, it's better to say, your innate and your adaptive immune response as opposed to first, second, third. I think that's something my teacher used to tell me as well. So just be aware of that. Sometimes it's easier to sort of comprehend your first, your second, and your third. But technically, like in when you're writing, in short answers, I would never really write first, second, or third. I'm sure depends how lenient your examiner is and all that sort of stuff, but it's always best to use terminology that's listed on the study design. Okay, so you've got your non-specific or your innate immunity and your adaptive or your specific immunity. So your non-specific immunity, and it's important to know differences between these. Your non-specific immunity is basically your one size fits all, works really quickly, sort of like instant, like putting a band-aid, ultimately. So whatever the pathogen is, if it's a virus, if it's a bacteria, if it's a prion, if it's a whatever, the innate immune system is going to act in the same way. Again, one size fits all. There is no memory of prior pathogens. So this idea of memory will make more sense when we talk about adaptive immunity, but it's this idea that it's one size fits all, and the cells that are involved with this, you could be infected with the same bacteria over and over again, but they won't recognize it, is the idea, whereas in adaptive, you do recognize it. And then the level of response being the same for each pathogen of the same organism. Again, that idea, if you're infected by the same bacteria over and over again, when innate immunity kicks in, it'll just kick in. It's one size fits all, exactly the same, copy and paste. Whereas with adaptive immunity, because you have that memory of past infections, if the same organism comes along, that memory kicks in really well and you get a bigger response, and then you get a bigger response, and you get a bigger response every time something, the same organism tries to infect, ultimately. Okay, so in terms of the first line of defense, so this is preventing pathogens from entering the individual, really. A big one is intact skin. You can see it's underlined intact. If you just say skin, you will not get the mark because the skin could be open, the skin could be damaged. Intact skin, it has to be closed. So that's obviously a pretty clear physical barrier. And that's why when it's open, that, skin is sort of useless if there's a big gaping hole in it, because then the bacteria can just jump right in. So mucus and your cilia in the airways. It's also important to know what is a sort of physical and what's a chemical, I believe. But I think it's in the other dot point. But your physical, your chemical, and your sort of microbiota, it's important distinctions to make. So your intact skin would be more physical. Your mucus and your cilia can ultimately be both a little bit. Basically because the mucus, I prefer to think about it in a physical sort of sense because I think it's easier to explain in a short answer. Your mucus can ultimately trap those pathogens, and then the cilia just pushes it so it gets sort of chucked, back out or like swallowed and stuff like that. But there are chemicals within the mucus as well that can help to sort of degrade that pathogen. So if you're going to describe it in a chemical aspect, just make sure that you're being specific and be mindful that VCA may ask you, what are some examples of physical barriers? What are some examples of chemical barriers? And you need to know different ones. So a low pH in the stomach, so this is chemical. Stomach acid is very acidic, so it can kill certain pathogens, but of course there are some bacteria that hang around in the stomach as well. So lysozyme, so these enzymes in your tears and in your saliva, they can help to degrade certain pathogens as well. So your good bacteria, this should be referred to as your microbiome, your microbiota. So they're found in other places on your body. It says a few exceptions, those are just sterile areas, but it's this idea that this microbiome helps because they compete with your bad bacteria. It's like a little bit of a good versus bad. So when let's say you have a poor microbiome, so I was talking about opportunistic pathogens before. If you take some antibiotics, let's say, they may be pretty general, and what they might do is they may end up killing some of the good flora, or like the good bacteria in your body, And what that means is there's sort of less competition. And so sometimes you can get other opportunistic infections. Often, like thrush can be an example. So sometimes you have a fungus that sort of sits around your mouth, for example. And sometimes if you take antibiotics, or even if you take like Ventolin, like if you take steroids, then you basically, yeah, kill some of the bacteria around, and then those pathogens that are left, they can become opportunistic and kind of grow. So that's why it's really important to keep a nice balance of the bacteria in your microbiome, for that reason, because the competition is really helpful in making sure that they don't get too crazy, but then also that, your actual foreign pathogens don't invade as well.